Hello, HIN 620. This screencast will go over the Chapter 12 exercises. This chapter went over views and how you can use them to restrict access to a database and to make a nice consistent way for end users to access the data. There is one downside of it that I know of, is that when you make a view, it's sort of hard-coded to what the tables currently look like. So if you make changes to the underlying tables, it might either break the view or give you data that you weren't expecting. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind for future development with views. So the first exercise was to create a view using the vendors and invoices tables to show you certain data that meets a certain criteria. So let's start by just kind of talking about the generic ways command to create a view. You can basically create with a view name, and then you give it the columns that you want to appear in the view, and then as the select statement. And of course, for here it looks simple as just select statement, but that's really the meat of the whole view as to what data you're actually selecting. So let's look at the view code that I came up with for the solution, where I created a view called payment due view, and the 4 columns that were requested was vendor name, invoice number, invoice total, balance due. And where balance due is actually a calculated column because it's not actually stored, which is a very good idea because you kind of want to calculate it on the fly. So the select statement, like I said, is the main part of this, where you are selecting the vendor name, invoice number, invoice total, and then you're doing the math right here in place of where balance due, where it's invoice total minus payment total minus credit total, and then you alias it to be balance due. And the 2 tables are using are vendors and invoices. And the way the 2 tables join up are the vendor ID from vendors equals the invoice vendor ID. And then the other criteria, as was mentioned in the exercise, is that you only want the balances that are greater than 0. So we put the formula here again and say greater than 0. And then the final thing they wanted you to do was to order it by the vendor name. So we put in the order by command and then gave it the column name. So I already created this view on my own, so I can show you it's right here. And then when you right click on it and say select, it runs and selects the data exactly as you want it. One thing you might notice here, just for cosmetic sake, is that these column headers will be whatever you put in the command here. So if you want it to look nice and pretty and you put a capital V and a capital N or something like that, it might look a little nicer. And then I thought I'd skip down to exercise 6 because that's a little different, where you're creating an update statement, which is something we haven't done yet. What you have is inserts, where you insert data into a table. Then you have select, where you're extracting data from it. And then you have 2 other modification commands, which are update and delete. So delete, you definitely want to be careful of because you don't want to delete what you actually want it to be there. And update is similar in that you're not really deleting the whole row. You're just modifying particular columns in a given row or set of rows. But it's still good to be careful to make sure that you're doing exactly what you want to. Well, let me just show you the example here, and I'll give you an example of something that could be really bad and that we've all done at some point. So the basic syntax is you're updating the name of the table, and you're setting this column equal to this value, next column equal to the next value, and so on until you're done, where some sort of conditions are set to be true. By the way, you might have noticed that I try to not put this all in one line. I try to put, update and then set on the next line and then where on the next line. It makes it a lot easier to read. Plus, when you get errors in the console, it'll say like line 3, line 2, and if it's all in one line, it'll just say line 1, and it's hard to figure out exactly where it is. So that's just something you might think about as well. An example. Well, let me paste in the what I came up with the answer for this. Well, first of all, let's go look at the actual data. That'd be a good idea. So if we look at the vendors, you'll see that this vendor 4 has the suite 260 as part of the vendor 1 address, and they want it to be part of the vendor 2 address. So not only do we have to move suite 260 into vendor 2, but we have to take it off of this one. So if we go back here, this is what I came up with, where you're updating the vendors table and you're setting vendor address 2 to suite 260 and vendor address 1 to the street without the suite on it. So that's the way you can get rid of it. And then it's where vendor ID equals 2, because that you only want to change it for that one. Now here's an example where you could do something really bad, is if you just said update vendors, set that to that and that to that, and you had no where clause. If you said go on this one, it would change every single row in your table to have vendor address 1 of 1990 Westwood Boulevard, blah, blah, blah. And that's obviously not what you want. So for update commands and delete commands, it's especially important to have a where clause in there. So if we run this, we'll see that it succeeded. And then if we go back over here and say select it again, this is the old one, new one, and you'll see the suite is now in address 2, work vendor address 2. So that is, I dare say, simple, but extremely powerful. So be careful when you use it, and that's about it. Thanks.